let's get started with Syria. Fam, for you, I know we're going to start with Syria, but I put up a tweet from one of your favorite people, and we're going to put it up on the screen. It was from Elizabeth Warren. I'm going to let Fiorella have at it, and you let Miss Elizabeth Warren know what was what.
Okay, so Elizabeth Warren said U.S. weapons may have ended up in the hands of al-Qaeda, linked fighters and separatist militia in Yemen, undermining our national security, oh God, and worsening the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. I'm demanding answers. And he said, seriously? For fuck's sake. No. U.S. weapons most certainly did end up in the hands of al-Qaeda itself because Obama's CIA illegally armed, trained, and salaried sectarian Islamist and jihadist militants, literally allied and embedded with al-Qaeda and ISIS for regime change in Syria. That is the correct answer. Ding, 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 ding.
Would you like to elaborate on that, Mark, and how this all got started in Syria?
I couldn't have said it better myself. So wait a minute, I didn't say that. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. And this continual denial, from even what, would think are progressive Democratic voices, of course, with the exception of Tulsi Gabbard in the Democratic Party, is really disheartening. And it, of course, happened under Obama's presidency, and a presidency that I actually, then volunteering for the Democratic Party, registered voters for. So in London, where I was at the time, American students and expats living in London. So it was really disheartening. And, it wasn't just in Yemen. It was in Libya and Syria and Yemen. And the Obama administration, they literally armed, trained, and salaried, head choppers and suicide bombers who were literally allied and embedded within a much larger Al-Qaeda and friends. I like to call them the 31 flavors of jihad. It's really, it's awful. I mean, it is, the worst possible thing. The Washington Post ran a story a couple of years ago, from Obama administration sources at the time, that they were funding them in Syria alone, the CIA, to a tune of $1 billion taxpayer dollars a year. And that's, of course, only part of what Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE and Kuwait and Turkey and the UK were also spending, all in an attempt to get rid of a, authoritarian, corrupt, but still secular government in Syria that was a bulwark, against jihadists in the region. That just a few years earlier, I mean, and then this isn't, this is fact established in the mainstream media by the New York Times, the Washington Post. The US and the UK used to take rendition subjects to Syria to torture them there. So there's no question that the Syrian government tortured some people, right?
Yeah.
Because we brought jihadists there to torture them. And then, of course, it simply became convenient under this pretext of this Arab Spring to exacerbate the tensions there, to direct them, to arm them, to get rid of a government that was problematic because it still had close ties with Iran. It still had close ties with Russia. It was an obstacle to designs for pipelines running gas from Qatar to Europe that was on the intentions there. Obama went with this, and they funded the very, very worst type of people. I mean, this is the exact same type of stuff that Carter and Brzezinski did in Afghanistan to train the Mujahideen, which is literally the jihadists. Right?
Yeah.
That's what that word means. To overthrow a socialist government in Afghanistan that brought in the Soviet intervention. Then, and Brzezinski referred to it as an attempt to lure the Soviet Union into their own Vietnam. And that led to the birth of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I mean, once the Mujahideen polished the government there off in the 90s. This is a policy of supporting the worst type of extremists, cynically, to achieve what some people see as U.S. I can't even call it national security goals, because it's not really about national security, of course.
No.
It doesn't affect U.S. national security in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, whether Bashar al-Assad is the president of Syria or not. This is always about global military hegemony, right? This is not, the U.S. has interests, right? The U.S. has interests everywhere in the world. I mean, there are 1,000+ U.S. military bases scattered around the world. That is the literal construction of empire. I mean, it doesn't have to be direct, suzerainty control of a territory. That's the way the British Empire started off, is with this archipelago of military bases, across the world, the empire that the sun never set on. And that's where the U.S. is today. And its tripod for hegemony in the Middle East is the U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia on one hand and Israel on the other. And Saudi Arabia, for the Sunni Shia divide, is enemies with Iran. Iran is enemies with Israel over Palestine, and the U.S. over the U.S.-backed coup to put the Shah in, decades ago. And Syria is an ally of Iran, therefore Syria must go. And that's the horrible geopolitical logic there. But if we had to support head choppers and suicide bombers to get it done, then we always imagine we can stick some Chalabi liberal types on the top of this mess. And come up with a functioning U.S. allied, quote, democracy, unquote.
Right.
Well, it didn't work in Iraq. It didn't work in Afghanistan. It didn't work in Libya. It didn't work in Syria. And it's not going to work in Yemen.
And it's really interesting. You hear the same key words: democracy, national security. You hear these key words, and that's when you know that they're invoking U.S. regime change. That's exactly what they want to do. Because if we had ever cared about spreading humanitarian aid or helping other people, there are very people in the United States and in other countries that we could have helped, like the Palestinians. But the U.S. never cares to help anybody unless there's a sort of interest in there. And it is very clear that now in the United States, we have people like Elizabeth Warren that are often propped as being progressives when actually they have very, very pro-war, pro-hawkish agendas for the military-industrial complex. I mean, she gets money from Raytheon. And they're propped up as being progressive. And people like Tulsi Gabbard, who are actually attacking the military-industrial complex, who are speaking out against regime change wars, are now Russian assets and vilified. And if it doesn't get any more clear as an outsider to you, that here right now we are not only fighting this election with the sort of economic issues that we have, but we are having a very either pro-war and pro-peace type of election. That's one of the reasons why so many people also voted for Donald Trump as well.
Yeah. And my question to add to all that is that, are you telling me that they lied to us in Rambo 3? Those weren't moderate rebels? I mean, wait, Mark, come on now. I mean, we talk about Hollywood being the arm of the military-industrial complex. That's a good example right there. I mean, the Mujahideen and what it is today. You put up another tweet. I'm sorry, did you want to?
The 80s, right? And Call of Duty, whatever the current iteration is today, where you're helping the white helmets battle the evil Russians in a Syria clone. I mean, it doesn't stop, does it?
No, not at all. We even thought a character in Fortnite, her name was Double Cross, could have been like Tulsi Gabbard. Like, she had a Hawaiian dress on and a patch. People say I'm crazy, but I was like, wait a second. Her name is Double Cross, and she looks like Tulsi a little bit. So, I mean, they're doing some deep planting. You retweeted Dan Cohen, and you like to retweet Dan Cohen a lot. He's awesome. And it says it wasn't long ago. What's that?
He is. He's definitely awesome.
He's amazing. He's one of my favorites, too, as well. You put, it wasn't long ago that Turkey's jihadists, shock troops slaughtering Kurds in Syria, were promoted by U.S. politicians and media hacks as cuddly, moderate rebels, like the ones in Rambo 3. I hold some of them accountable in my latest video that he put up. Now, in Western media, the mainstream media has been exploiting the Kurds just to attack Donald Trump. And I don't want to start demonizing anybody whatsoever, but I've watched a lot of your shows. I read a lot of the stuff, that's going on when it comes to the Kurds. Can you give us an overall analogy of the plight of the Kurds and how we got here today?
Yeah. So the Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the world that doesn't have a state, a nation state that is a Kurdish nation state. Now, that might tend a lot of people to support the idea of Kurdish independence and so on. Personally, I'm not a big advocate of the ideology of ethnic nationalism, the idea that a political state's borders should be completely congruous with a majority of one ethnic population. Right? This is an ideology that emerged in Europe, and the creation of a France where French people live in France and a Germany where German people live in Germany and so on. That happened after hundreds of years of fratricidal and genocidal warfare and ethnic cleansing that started with the wars of Spanish succession and still aren't over. They still happened recently in Yugoslavia and in Ukraine today. There's still basic conflicts over national identity and the formations of nations. So I have sympathy for particularly the Kurds in Turkey and Syria because they're of a leftist bent. But it's important to remember that the Kurds are not one unified monolithic people. They're spread largely between 4 states, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and they have different politics and different leaders in every one of those 4 countries. So even the idea of trying to chip away a piece of each one of those countries to form some type of Kurdish state, which none of those countries will allow, and at least 2 of them are U.S. allies, at least on paper.
Yeah.
Turkey, a NATO member, and Iraq with still a U.S. vaguely supported government there, after the overthrow of Saddam. They are never going to agree to an independent Kurdish state in the area. They're never going to even agree to an autonomous Kurdish region in one of the countries because of the inspiration and knock-on effect that would have among their own Kurdish minority. And then once that goes, if you give the Kurds a state, do the Druze get a state then? Do the Alawites get a state? Where does that stop? And you can't force Middle Eastern countries that are already suffering from these post-British Empire and Ottoman Empire colonial boundaries to then try to fit into a nation-state mold, because the wars would never stop, not in our lifetimes. And in a lot of ways, this ethnic and religious divides, are fueling the conflicts in Syria and elsewhere today. So the Kurds end up on kind of the short end of that stick. There definitely have been repressed in Turkey for a long time. It's important to note that not all of the Kurds in Turkey are Syria, politically are supported or support the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or its Syrian antecedent, the Kurdish People's Protection Units, the YPG. But they do represent a large, I would say, plurality, if not a majority, of the Kurdish people in those 2 countries. And when the regime change war, I'm sorry to use Tulsi Gabbard's Russian propaganda term here, to overthrow the Syrian government started, and the Syrian government had to contract and was under assault, and the jihadist forces started taking over the east, and they concentrated around the core coastal cities to protect them. They told the Kurds, we can't protect you and provide you with some arms and some money, but we don't have the manpower. You're on your own. You have autonomy. Good luck. And the Kurds in Syria in that situation, they turned to the U.S. For help as the U.S. was starting to look to get involved in eastern Syria in the fight against ISIS. Now, but it's important to remember that while the Pentagon started backing the Kurds in the Obama administration, the CIA was backing the Free Syrian Army and these other Islamist groups that were also fighting the Kurds.
Yeah.
And we had a CIA-backed FSA Islamists, right, allied with Al-Qaeda, and they were actually allied with ISIS too before they were against them. If you remember back to 2013, when the U.S.-backed Free Syrian Army was signing treaties of alliance with ISIS to take East Aleppo. That's not something anyone wants to talk about today. But CIA-backed Islamists versus Pentagon-backed Kurds, and that tells you something about the coherency of the Obama administration's policy for whatever it was trying to do in Syria. Make things a mess and hope Assad goes away. It was incoherent. It was badly thought through. It estranged the U.S. from allies in Turkey and Iraq, and it devastated Syria and resulted in the U.S. owns a high degree of responsibility, not just Assad, for hundreds of thousands of deaths in Syria. And the Kurds, they particularly when Trump came into office, and I don't like the man personally or his economics or anything else, but he largely ended, as much as he knew, CIA support for the Islamists and doubled down on the Pentagon support for the Kurds and made the Kurds into the proxy force for what became the U.S. then direct military occupation of East Syria. And the Kurds went with it. I mean, they saw a long shot chance for autonomy, and there evidently were some U.S. officials even promising them pie in the sky things like independence or a perpetual U.S. protectorate in East Syria. That was never on the table. And those U.S. officials who made those types of promises to, like James Jeffrey, to the Kurds, there's a special place in hell reserved for them, and I hope there's some Kurds there waiting for them when they get there. But the Kurds' only ever real hope from the Islamists now, and all of these former groups that used to be backed by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Russia has kind of edged them out of the conflict one by one. So now there's a three-way Mexican standoff. The only one supporting the jihadists now, though it supports a lot of them, is Turkey.
Yeah.
And Turkey has, in Idlib, there's the control of Al-Qaeda, now rebranded as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, along with their allies, the Turkestan Islamic Party, not even Syrians, and Haras al-Din, which is like Al-Qaeda on steroids. And they still control Idlib with Turkish support, with Turkish occupation called observation posts, with convoys from Turkey every day carrying arms and gasoline and food and so forth. And they control Idlib. Turkey then controls a whole stretch of Syrian territory along the north central from the former Kurdish canton of Afrin through the important mountain pass from Turkey to Syria, the Jarablus corridor. And Turkey's been occupying this for 3 years now, and they're not leaving. And they want to drive out all the Kurdish people from this area. North Syria is where most of the Syrian Kurds live, and repopulate it with a lot of the 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey.
Yeah.
A lot of them are these Islamist fighters and their families and people sympathetic to them and Turkmen, and ethnically cleanse northern Syria, getting rid of a security threat as they see it, and repopulating it with a protectorate that has leverage over Damascus and is loyal to Turkey, which created it and supports it. And the Kurds are caught in this today. And Max Blumenthal did an excellent report at the Gray Zone Project that 21 out of 28 of these original groups now supported by Turkey as their, quote, Syrian National Army, as they're now calling them, used to be backed by the U.S. And now there's all this outcry from U.S. politicians about all the horrible, and they are horrible crimes they're committing against the Kurdish people in eastern Syria. The Turks and their jihadi proxies basically invading the U.S. invasion of eastern Syria. And they're all crying, and it is terrible. I don't want to see the Kurdish civilian population of East Syria suffer. But they were doing the same thing all across Syria for, the last 7-8 years, and there was no outcry when that was happening. So it's all really a bit hypocritical,
Yeah.
and it's amazing the moral hoops that you have to jump through, moral logical hoops to continue to support this spinning position of hegemony as the dice fall. But the Kurds' only real hope is for a reconciliation with a Syrian government out of Damascus.
Absolutely.
That at least afforded them some degree, a fairly high degree as far as the Middle East is concerned, of political representation, ethnic and religious rights, and they can bargain for more. Now, throughout the course of this conflict, the Kurds, the YPG, the Syrian Democratic Forces, whatever you want to call them, they refused repeated U.S. entreaties to turn on the Syrian government because they didn't see them as enemies. And the Syrian government never seriously fought them. So there's a lot of hope for reconciliation there. And that's the role Russia is trying to play, is contain Turkey's land grab in Syria, while at the same time bringing the Kurds and the Syrian government back together to rebuild their country. And the U.S. still is trying to play the spoiler. They can't get regime change by their proxy war. So economic blackmail by sitting on the oil, denying it for the reconstruction and rebuilding of the country.
You're jumping ahead to our next topic over there. I got a good tweet from Mark Sleboda I'm trying to play over here about the Russians. Go ahead, fam. I'm so sorry.
Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you were kind of jumping on there. So Donald Trump is just being like a straight up gangster, as Pasta would say, because he's going after, Syria's oil. So let's take a quick peek. Pasta, you want to go ahead and read the...
Yeah, there's a Twitter we have over here, but it's pretty much the... you put up the video. I call it a Twitter. It's a tweet. My fam's got to correct me all the time. It says, Trump's plunder doctrine in action. They can pipe it or make use of it, but can sit on it to play destabilizing spoiler, prevent Syria from recovering economically and rebuilding, and try to force regime change via economic blackmail now. And I just want to take a little quick peek at what Donald Trump said, because, God bless the man for at least being completely open, honest on what, you know what I'm saying? God, for at least no politician of America would say this except for Donald Trump. Yeah, we're taking the oil.
We've secured the oil, and therefore a small number of U.S. troops will remain in the area where they have the oil. And we're going to be protecting it, and we'll be deciding what we're going to do with it in the future. In any event, by the moves that we've made, we're achieving a much more peaceful and stable area.
I mean, Mark, WTF? I mean, what are they going to do? Are they going to make it part of Jordan now? Or are they going to make it part of Iraq? I mean, tell me what they're going to do with this here, because this is just hysterical.
Yeah, I want to give Trump credit to the man that, he's predictable on this. And I said at the time that I expected some neocon genius to play the oil card with Trump and get him to keep troops in Syria. And sure enough, it was Lindsey Graham, at least according to the Washington Post, that did the arguing. And Lindsey, hey, you're good at what you do. And he manipulated Trump's febrile and mercurial little mind with the thing that he's always been obsessed with. And, give Trump credit for honesty that U.S. presidents have never had in their real aims, whether it's in Iraq or in Libya or so on. I mean, it's never solely about oil, but that's always part of the foreign policy, calculation of why we're going in there, for control of oil flows. And, that's exactly what's happening here. But how now the Russians and the Syrian government have been brought by the Kurds that are currently trying to sleep in two beds again, across the Euphrates into eastern Syria, all along the border, starting to come down along the border with Iraq. True. These oil fields are in the middle of southeast Syria in Deir ez-Zor, a desert province, populated by Arab tribes. And it's far away from Iraq or Jordan. And how the U.S. is going to maintain a few hundred troops out there to keep control of this oil, keep them supplied, keep them repurposed? Are they going to conduct a continual air resupply out of Iraqi Kurdistan? Because the Turks certainly aren't going to help them now. I don't know how they think this is actually going to work. Are they going to be forced to seize territory going all the way to Iraq and take over part of the Iraqi-Syrian border too? Is that what it will come to? Whatever. This is a recipe for more creeping escalation, right?
Yeah.
They fed Donald Trump on this, right? A minimal force and everything, but that will never work. And once he's bought into this, he's going to have to build into more to keep it resupplied, to keep it stable. And again, a big part of the calculation, deny the oil to the Syrian government, but also there's this fantasy that simply by sitting in East Syria, it somehow interrupts Iranian supplies and influence through Iraq, which became allied with Iran after the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein. Thank you very much. You give a Shia majority democracy, and they're going to ally themselves with the Shia country next door.
Absolutely.
U.S. created that geopolitical backlash all on their own. Lebanon, Syria, which is now more closely allied with Iran than they ever were before, since Iran helped come to their aid during this conflict, and with Hezbollah in Syria. But simply by sitting in the middle of the Syrian desert or even an Al-Tanf base in the south, that's not helping stop Iranian influence. It's actually encouraging it. It's amazing thinking. But part of the real calculation here is to keep Syria continually destabilized and weak. And if Syria is destabilized and weak, which of course gives always a power vacuum for ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others to grow, that provides further justification for the U.S. to be in the area, to fight the terrorists that their presence there is helping create because of the power vacuum that they're making. And it deprives Iran of a solid Syria as an ally. A destabilized Syria is a Syria that isn't aiding Hezbollah as much or isn't as focused on that. And Lebanon's got its own political problems right now.
Yeah. The Russians, though, because you kind of alluded to that, the Russians have kind of said they're going to stand up for Syria. They have vowed that they were going to stand up. Do you see this conflict with Syria rising up? Because obviously now we're seeing the alliances, Syria and Russia, and then obviously now this can escalate into something bigger.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been the potential all along. And Russia has actually thought this through very carefully when they decided to intervene in Syria in 2015. And they've played a complicated geopolitical dance that sees Putin, basically, I like to see it as waltzing across a chessboard with Erdogan, with both of them with daggers raised against each other's back, waiting to plunge it in. And that's the reality of the situation, where Russia's able to have good economic and other political relations with Turkey outside of Syria and manage their relationship. But they're actually technically at war in Syria itself. And they're managing that conflict. Russia, in a hope to give Turkey, Erdogan, the saving face that he needs, and the time to realize that his position is untenable there, to withdraw while containing the Americans at the same time, and that's now proving more difficult. But a lot of people don't realize this. Russia has had a mutual defense pact with Syria for decades now. I mean, there has been a Soviet, then a Russian military base, a naval base, wasn't much until a few years ago, in Tartus for a long time. And Russia was always going to see the overthrow of at least tepidly allied Syria to jihadi forces. That there were some 3,000 at least Russian and former Soviet citizens fighting on the side of the jihadists, right?
Yeah.
Wahhabists of Chechen, Ingus, Dagestani, and other origins in Russia that came to Syria to form some form of the Islamic Caliphate or Emirate, and if they won in Syria, you could bet they would be back in southern Russia. Syria, the northeastern tip of Syria is only 24 hours by jeep to southern Russia. That's Russia's part of the world, and the potential jihadi terrorism, coming back up into Russia that way from a Saudi Turkish proxy state in Syria was just something that Russia, for real legitimate national security reasons, the security of their own country, could never allow. And when they see that Damascus could actually fall to ISIS or Al Qaeda or Ahrar al-Sham or some combination of the three, some type of splintering of Syria, that's when they went in 2015. And that's exactly when Obama and Erdogan were both planning, Erdogan at that time pushing Obama towards it, the idea of a safe zone across northern Syria that would be a duplicate of what was pulled off in Libya, where you declare Benghazi a safe zone and then expand that until you then eventually move against the capital. And Russia saw that was what was on the books, and they went in and they stopped it. And everything since has been to get one player after another to quit the conflict. And now it's just down to the U.S. and Turkey.
Wow, that's good. I mean, it's crazy when you think about Syria, like
Yeah.
Obama, how bad he was on foreign policy. We say it all the time. We're not trying to trash on the ex-president, but I mean, like you said, one side is for the Pentagon's, funding the Kurds, while the CIA is funding the jihadists, and the military-industrial complex is funding all sides, making a ton of money. And the fact that he allowed this to happen, Timber Sycamore, talk about it all the time.
Yeah, Sycamore.
It's crazy.
Pam, specifically, you asked about direct conflict, the potential of blowing up.
Yeah.
Russia's been very careful, doing everything possible to avoid direct conflict with Turkey or the U.S.
Yeah.
But now they are, all three of them, in the same space, including the Syrian government and Iran, and 80,000 jihadis under Turkish proxy arms now in the Syrian National Army. There's 80,000 of them. And the Kurds, and they're all in this tight, explosive space still in northeast Syria. And everyone is trying to prevent a direct conflict between Russia and Turkey and the U.S. or any combination of the three in this Mexican standoff there. But this is exactly where mistakes and misunderstandings and so on can happen and escalate. Russia's trying to avoid it. I don't think the U.S. wants war with Russia in Syria either. But anything could happen. The potential for catastrophe still exists and is possibly even higher than ever.
Wow. You got a super chat?
We're going to do some super chats and get on to the next topic, Ukraine. That was awesome. There's so much stuff I learned. I can't wait to go back and watch not only myself with Mark Sleboda on the Convo Couch, but everything we talked about, man. It's great. And we're going to get on to Ukraine, which is even better because Ukraine is even more misunderstood by Westerners than Syria. I mean, they have no idea what's going on about Ukraine. But let me...